Hello, everybody. Bienvenido. Good day. Welcome. Glad you're here. Glad I'm here. We are continuing here in San Francisco the rather traditional late summer experience where in November we're having summery days. So I'm out for a walk. I've been listening to some old recordings of John Mack, the famous experiencer researcher who studied what are sometimes referred to as abductees. And I want to talk in a deep way about this. John Mack was a I lost the word here. He was a psychologist and began as an absolute disbeliever in this entire range of phenomena, UFO, UAP, anomalous experiences. And I guess he was sort of recruited in a way by Bud Hopkins. John Mack interviewed the children and teachers in the aerial school incident in Africa. I do not recall the year. I believe it was in the 90s. And John is an absolutely brilliant and articulate mind, far more trustworthy than any skeptic or debunker I've ever heard, nearly none of which I find trustworthy. In fact, this entire range, this problematical range of human behavior and psyops is one of the concerns I'm going to explore, I think, today, if things go in my awareness and thought and discovery and anamnesis as planned. I'm sure they will diverge from that. So in one of the talks, a semantic issue necessarily arises. Hi. And it's the concern with what is meant when someone or some group of people or some, even more bizarrely, some hypothetical group of people asks, well, what do you mean by real? Because they want to know, is this phenomenon real? But actually they don't want to know that. Most of them begin wanting to know that it is not real, right? So they start out with a bias on which they plant their flag and remain largely unconvincible, regardless of the, regardless of the, quote, anecdotal, unquote, evidence of millions of people who've had direct experiences, millions of pages of records, photographs, readings of data, analysis, and so forth. But we'll get to that. So before something has just occurred to me for the first time. Thankfully, I still have insights, and I'm not merely reading from some book of my own thought and experience, which would be tragic and stupefying if that were the case. My goal as always, is to learn to see. So, I had this insight that arose on the use of the word abductee. And ordinarily, in common parlance, this word is used to describe people who have been, the language that we use is very, very strange and dangerous. Though we wouldn't want to dismiss the features of it that are reliable or credible. But they have been, we use the word taken, but we could also use the word introduced. And this has a very different association set to some form of what appears to be a non-human intelligence or intelligences. And obviously this entire topic encompasses a broad array, broad topology or continuum of phenomena, circumstances, situations, memories, attestations, testimony, and so forth. So the idea that it's one thing is impossible. There are no such things. There are things that are more or less one thing. In other words, I like to use the example of a fork in my dish rack. Because its scope of being is limited by its construction and our way of thinking about it, we are inclined to see it as a single thing that we reliably understand, because again, as an artificial object, most of the dimensions of its potential form, function, nature, composition, and so forth have been normalized, right? So we've snipped off, and this is one of the great abilities and most dangerous abilities of humans. We have the capacity to produce these artificial objects, which we think of as being produced for a single purpose. Right? The fork, the obvious purpose is to convey food from plates to our mouths. Yet even the fork, limited in its form, origin, history, and function as it may be, has infinite qualities. This is necessarily the fact. It's a very strange fact, because what it means is that you will never capture, it is impossible to capture the qualities or the characteristics, particularly if you introduce relationships with other objects, which is also a necessity if we're looking for complete knowledge, the facts. We should introduce the least acknowledged fact about any object, situation, circumstance, being, relationship, array, in experience. They all have infinite qualities, and this is primarily what is denied, sort of de facto, and without acknowledgement, by we who use language in this way, in these ways, that limit our perception, participation, perspective, capacities for learning and insight, liberation, wonder, and awe. And these limitations, have some function. We wouldn't want to get rid of them altogether, but we should always preserve a deep and abiding awareness of their incompleteness and the inclination of human awareness, minds, consciousness, and so forth. When we come under the domination of this feature of conceptual thought and language, we should maintain an awareness that these are provisional. They are, in fact, suppositions, even if they appear to be declarative, explicit facts. So, in terms of abductions, and I believe that it's actually true, that every human being is, quote, an experiencer in the sense meant on, the Reddit, the subreddit, right? Someone who has experienced non-ordinary experiences, phenomena, situations, encounters, and so forth. We are all experiencers, and part of the reason why we are experiencers is that we encountered an entirely alien culture living inside the humans that were our parents. There's nothing as alien as the systems and cultures and infrastructures that modernity impose upon us, capture us with, enslave us to, bind us with, as if a dark magic were afoot. So, we seem to think like the aliens are dangerous. Well, there is nothing as dangerous as the strident, tyrannical, authoritarian stupidity that is imposed on us by our usually relatively shallow, but sometimes deep, relationships with all that has captured humans at the group level and puppets them and imprisons them and destroys them and the world they arise in. Consistently, intentionally, there's nothing you could encounter that is as alien as this. We take all of this at, as just part of the situation here, but the children are much less inclined to do so until they become well scripted. And many of us resisted that scripting, and we did not believe in it, and we could see through the the 5,000 layer deep curtains of bullshit and lying that comprise the the costume that is forced on our minds to expect only that which is normal, to see only that which has been properly adjudicated, to admit to awareness or consciousness or reflection or exploration only that for which there is ironclad evidence, and so forth. This is the morass, this is the garbage disposal of human intelligence that runs at an ever-increasing speed and breeds new forms of itself 1 billion times per second, and just eats the minds and lives of human beings and our world all day, every day. Are there any virtuous aspects? Yes. Are they trivial compared to the effect of the malignant aspects? Generally, except in such local or specific circumstances where they liberate or heal or rescue a being. But what do we primarily need rescue from? This entire system of lies. This is what we need rescue from. So part of the reason why I think every human being is an experiencer is that we were abducted by a false, a not human aspect of processes, ideas, declarations, laws, accounting games, and all of this kind of stuff that we were born into. And this is a far more cruel abduction than probably anything experienced by people who tell us their experiences of having encountered non-ordinary beings, intelligences, craft, and so forth. Are those even craft, right? We have this idea of vehicle, and so, if people get out of an apparently separate object, we simply presume it's a vehicle. But what if vehicles are a lesser stasis of a thing we don't have a concept for, which has always been true, right? It doesn't matter whether it's true or not, this story, but we hear stories of South American indigenous people seeing ships from Spain and having no idea what those could possibly be. And then men came out with metal armor and stuff, and guns and things. How could they possibly know what that is? Do we even know what that is? It turns out that as human knowledge systems develop, and as they capture us and each other in a kind of perversely incentivized zero-sum game of collapsing our potential into explicit skeletal remains and then selling these back to us at ever-increasing prices. This is a counterfeiting con. But it turns out that it is necessarily the case that beings futurial to us have and will likely, and have as in this has happened over and over again, and will likely revise the structures, considerations, expectations, orientations, purposes with which we evaluate identity. And so the possibility space of humans gaining deeper understanding is as infinite as these qualities of any being or situation, and it will always advance. There is no such thing as final knowledge of anything unless what we determine the finality with is a set of axioms that we ourselves imposed for the purpose of calling it final when it can never be thus. So I think we are all experiencers. We have all been abducted by aliens, and they're called corporations, governments, ideologies, branches on the tree of human conserved knowledge, which is at least as dangerous as it can be liberating. Always dangerous, sometimes liberating. So yes, Mack studied abductees, and what a brilliant and sophisticated mind he was. As I understand it, to use the British colloquialism, he was knocked down by a car in Europe. I do not recall which part of Europe. I suspect France or Britain. And there is some controversy surrounding this. Again and again in the historical record, we find people who are attempting to bring to light new ways of seeing or thinking or knowing that threaten the infrastructure of domination under which we are enslaved, having unusual accidents. Now, of course, everyone has accidents. Accidents can happen to everyone. But there's, a deep and suspicious history of this kind of thing here. And I'm not sure, I don't really have a perspective on what happened to Mack, but it's certainly not outside the realm of possibility that he was killed on purpose. He was a dangerous mind. He had evidence, he had ways of seeing, ways of thinking about these phenomena that were radical and insightful, credible, profound and compelling. So for any organ of the systems that dominate human collectivity, that intend to obscure, capture, weaponize, and deploy knowledge of these phenomena against human populations, their own and others, this kind of person represents a very dangerous threat. So yeah, I've been listening to Mack lately. I read his book on nightmares some time ago, which I think he wrote before he became involved in the phenomena, quote unquote, the phenomenon. And it was very clinical. was he a psychiatrist or a psychologist? I'm not sure. And what psychiatrist means has radically changed over the past 20 years, although what anything means has radically changed. Meaning itself has changed. And I found some features of his talks and his desires to help humans see better, one of my favorite things, compelling. He spoke of something that I think he called ontological tyranny, or ontological authoritarianism, or in a way, ontological fascism, right? Where we are told by people with little or no knowledge of some topic or subject that we should not entertain anything related to this subject or topic because it is unproven. Where is the evidence? Where is the proof? I see this all over the UFOs Reddit, the aliens Reddit. I can't tell if it's bots or humans. It kind of doesn't matter because these days many human minds are really just bots, mostly. It does matter. So, where is the proof? We hear this over and over again, and something's happening, and there's no evidence, no proof. Well, I think we need to talk and think very carefully about what is meant by real. So imagine in your mind an open-ended parabola coming down, let's say, from the upper left to its accessible endpoint on the lower right, or its accessible boundary. So it's open at the top, right? The parabola essentially goes on forever. And this parabola represents the infinite space of qualities, characteristics, and derivable intelligence about any situation. Infinite. There is no way that it is not infinite. Right? If we localize our concern enough so that we are only looking at the fork in my dish rack, it's still infinite because there are endless qualities and characteristics at the submicroscopic level. To have a finite and complete description of the fork, I'm sure would be impossible, even if we constrain our concern only to the physical dimensions that the fork, exists as. But then if we include anything about relationship or consciousness itself, we need to add like 5 more similar infinite parabolas. Yeah? So the idea that you can have complete, correct knowledge about anything is not the result of having complete or correct knowledge. It is the result of having limited the scope of one's concerns to such a degree that the 3 or 4 concerns that you might have started with can be reasonably answered, and thus the inquiry can come to a close. That has nothing to do with the real. That's a game humans play in cognition. That is a left hemisphere-like game. The right hemisphere would flee in disgust from such a game. And in this parabola, we can make some other parabolae, parabolas. And most of what concerns humans is right down near a point at the lower right edge. So if you draw like a tiny little circle in there, this is what the humans generally will find themselves arguing about. And what this has to do with is also not reality. No common person, there might be some exceptions. The humans are a topology, and there are tall mountains in that topology. Some of those are cohorts of humans, some of them are individual humans, many of them are young children, who we devalue the awareness and intelligence and sensitivities of because, we say, they don't know how things work. Yes, that's true. They are as yet unabducted by human language and enculturation and capitalism and communism and ideology and, the bizarre and truly alien to life and intelligence activities of the quote-unquote societies in which they are born and in which they arise and develop. So there are exceptions to what I'm about to say, but there are basically zero people you will commonly encounter that have any idea what anything is. Their knowledge of the identity of objects or relationships or situations is clumsy, provisional, crude, largely informed by lying and nonsense, and that's about to become vastly more common with the onset of LLMs and so forth. So these are the deceived, right? Not only are they unaware of the true nature of reality or existence, origin, being, organisms, animals, human animals. What they have are these little kind of tokenized shitty maps, right? Where if you start out with some simple axioms, you can fulfill the requirements of a broken form of rationality, primarily subtained? Primarily imposed on us by features of left hemispheric-like concern, which have to do with the eviction of ambiguity, the solution to the problem of identity, nature, function, futures, prediction, all of these kinds of things. And this is the least reliable form of knowledge outside of any contingent context within which it is useful or appropriate. These are contexts that mostly have to do with science or mathematics. This kind of clinicism, where we run a study on some cohort and we get the p-values and we determine, p greater than 0.05 or something like this, which is a measure of confidence in the data set. And then comes the interpretation. There's no data that interprets itself because data is abstract. Experience, direct experience, the softness of the grass under my feet, that rather interprets itself, but by the time I'm calling it softness, I have departed from the experience. Nomenclature departs from the true and the real. And then it sort of circularly comes back and says, no, that wasn't true or real, I am true or real. Right? We think, mostly thinking thinks us. It's a process that runs in our minds and cognition, claiming to be us when it is not, and can never be. That's a form of abduction, right? So all of the deleterious things that we may have heard, Bud Hopkins was elucidating some rather startling perspectives. That the aliens are, that nothing they tell us can be trusted. Aliens meaning, pointing at these beings that humans report experiences of, beings and situations. But I think we should have far greater skepticism about the traps that we encounter among humans, and humans are vastly less trustworthy than beings that may be able to traverse time-space or even the domains of consciousness and that which generates it, and they come to us to learn and communicate. Because we must imagine that if they had truly deleterious orientations, they would easily overcome us as a species, This does not seem to be the case. However, there are perspectives from which it is important to maintain that possibility. Where was I going here? I lost my train of thought. So, it turns out that there's a fundamental problem with these bizarre and transient desires to debunk. And the problem has many wings. One of the wings is that insight does not depend on truth. To learn or to grow or to see better, you can see better with a metaphor that can be proven to be wrong. Right? You can see better with a simile that can be proven to be wrong. It's not hard to prove that metaphors and similes aren't true. They are figures, first of thought or conception, and then of speech. So there are contingent contexts within which truth and falsehood are very important, and we wouldn't want to lose track of those. But these are largely clinical, and they should never pervade over the entire space of our awareness, our curiosity, our urge to see better and to learn more and more deeply. But what is the real? What is real? Well, the problem here is that the very foundations of the systems of thought that we use to determine whether or not something is, quote, real or not, unquote, are themselves underpinned by imagination, which is not measurable. So the very feature of awareness they're not really skeptics, because a skeptic is someone who wants to see better and learn, but is careful about how they go about the process. And most today, skepticism means something very different. It means the outright denial of some situation, process, viewpoint, perspective. And the trenchant militaristic defense of this denial. This is not skepticism. This is ontological fascism. Yeah. This is a trap and a weapon. The very features of awareness that forge the intent to debunk, right, or to explicitly state the impossibility of some phenomena, experience, so forth. That feature is not real and could never be evidenced. In other words, it's much like the problem where people say, oh, that's just your imagination. Really? Well, are you imagining that it's my imagination? Because if you're not, how did you come to that conclusion? Isn't your rationality a way of structuring imagination? Right? You see the problem here? All of these sort of tyrannical claims on truth or facticity, while again there are contingent contexts in which such perspectives are useful, when that motivation escapes those contexts and intends to dominate the entire field of human intelligence, perspectival liberty, learning, seeing better, being less wrong, and so forth. Now we are in the grip of a demon that presents itself, as usual, as a messiah. I will rescue you from all those false things that you've thought or suspected or been told. Now, this is ironic because I am very interested in rescuing myself and others from false things. Right? But it turns out that the vast library of bullshit, ontological lying, that serves the existing systems that dominate humans in our world is not the protector. This is a replacement con. So the most real aspects of our nature are experiential. Very few of these can be proven. I mean, consider the problem. Suppose that in the morning, very early, when most people are asleep, I walk to the ocean and I jump in and I swim. And while I'm under the water, with my eyes open, I'm not sure if I've done that in salty water. Perhaps I might have goggles. I come face to face with a dolphin. And maybe there's some communication between us. I feel the dolphin is interested in me, or it communicates something to me that it can sense or see. Or it may communicate that it's very concerned about my people and I need to plead with them to stop being insane and omnicidal. But whatever the case, even if I only see the dolphin. Yep. Now I come back home, and let's say later in that day, I'm in a group of people and they're talking about reality. And I tell my story. I say, this morning I went and I swam. And while I was under the water, I saw a dolphin. It came right up to me. It looked me in the eye. And there was some communication that happened. Now imagine that some portion of the group says, no, it didn't, prove it. I'm not going to believe you. You're just making things up. I have no reason to believe you saw a dolphin. I'm not even sure you were in the ocean. How will I prove a private experience? Where is the proof? And even if there was another person with me and there were witnesses, the same objections could easily arise. And in much of the domain where humans in ridiculous cohorts that aren't even cohorts, right? Just agglomerations of internet stupidity and abject, divisiveness, organized, mediated, intentionally produced divisiveness. We encounter this all the time. Right? Rupert Sheldrake, a brilliant mind, a genius of a human being, a loving, amazing human being. Randall Carlson. These are people who have studied human history outside the academy. Who's the other gentleman? I'm missing his name. Perhaps it'll come to me. He wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, maybe, which inspired a whole generation of amateur archaeologists and explorers. Perhaps you know his name. These people are slaughtered, they're constantly assailed, accused of being Nazis, racists, appropriation, everything, every accusation you can possibly imagine, with few exceptions, have been leveled at these folks. Why? Because they work outside the systems of ontological tyranny, ontological authoritarianism, ontological terrorism that dominate much of the academy, particularly in America. There's reasons for that. We are psyop wonderland here in the United States. We are the great petri dish of the world's psyops and our own. So what is meant by real? Well, I want you to imagine that most of the real is and will always remain mysterious, right? Incompletely understood, incompletely captured in models, maps, or language. This is necessarily the fact. If you're really concerned about facts, This fact pervades over all other facts. And generally what humans conceive of as facts, while they use words like objective, or, repeatable, or empirical. Yeah. What these really mean is quite different from what they are proposed and commonly thought to mean. Yeah. What they mean is that there's a kind of general agreement among some perceivable cohort of humans who've examined the phenomena and tried experiments and so forth. By the way, you can't pull your own intent, motivations, orientations, perspectival desires, and biases out of the experiment. There is no way to do that. Experiments include human concern, human thought, human conception, and the conceptions prevalent in the time the experiment is performed. These expectations and desires and purposes will change in the future. They will be different. This is why there is learning and development and discovery. So once again, the idea of a finished fact, completely wrong, with the exception of contexts of very limited scope, within which we have so circumscribed our concerns that they can then be satisfied to our approval. So we should realize that reality is by nature mysterious and something even more staggering. One of the amazing things that came out in one of the conversations with John Mack is they were talking about the problem of influence in a therapeutic environment or a clinical situation where one is speaking with someone who has experiences, feelings, memories, and so forth. And they were discussing the problem of influencing, the power of the interlocutor, the power of the psychologist or the clinician to accidentally influence the situation. And this is a problem that is well known, even in physical science and medicine and physics and so forth. How do we know that our suppositions about the nature of the experiment or the way we set it up or the cohort we gathered, the incompleteness of that cohort, the specificity of that cohort, how do we know? How can we know? Is it possible to know? To what degree can we subtract that? Well, it depends. But to an absolute degree, never. That's a fact. Right? A perfect example is provided by the brilliant and eccentric Brett Weinstein, Eric's brother. There was this situation, I think it was in the 80s, where the scientific community was operating under the delusion that wild-type mice had long telomeres. And Brett became concerned about this because long telomeres can protect you against the effects that we use mice to study to get a glimpse of what might, maybe happen in humans. And so Brett, went out and got some wild-type mice, right? Mice from nature of the same species that were being used in labs around the world. And he discovered they did not have long telomeres. The lab mice had long telomeres. The wild-type mice did not. Why was that? Well, it turned out that the way the lab mice were being bred produced long telomeres in them. I won't go into the details on that. You can explore it yourself if you're interested. Just look up Brett Weinstein, long telomeres, etc. and find out what happened. You'll find out what Brett told us happened. Now, here we have the same problem. Is Brett telling us the facts? Right? This is anecdotal. Brett is just telling us things. How do we know? Under what circumstances are the data available to you? Almost never. So if you think somebody's going to suddenly come up and dump, 10,000 pages of data on you in order to oppose some, debunker or ontological tyrannist, or this is never going to happen. And even if it did, there was another situation where Mac was in a conversation with someone, and he said, so-and-so, I think the guy's name was Chet. Chet, if a UFO landed on the White House lawn and there were newscasters and all kinds of people there, and photographs were taken and video was taken and there were witnesses and you could interview them, I'm pretty sure you'd still say the phenomenon doesn't exist, it's not real. And Chet said, I think you kind of got me there. So, I don't really care much about what people believe or don't believe or how they arbitrate confidence in claims about reality. The fundamental thing is our experience. It's what happens to me when I dive into the ocean and see the dolphin. What portion of that is even expressible, right? And similarly, what portion of that could data capture? Less than 0.0001%? And this is what we take as the arbiter of credibility and validity? No. That's insane. This is what the children find terrifying in the adults around them and in their school systems. They can see through the charade. We all begin with this capacity. It gets pounded out of us over time. So, the portion of the real upon which you can get a grasp through data experiment, analysis, interpretation, rechecking the data, is an important aspect of human knowledge systems, again, until and unless it escapes the contingent context in where it is useful, and then proposes that it should naturally preside over all features of knowledge, belief, speculation, and so forth. This is the terrifying monster in the human cognitium that eats worlds. Right? Now, philosophically and linguistically, if somebody tables a truth claim, and I've made a bunch of them here, if there's good reason, we should call them, to demonstrate the pivots upon which their convictions ride. And hopefully, if we're really good at this game, we will first steelman their argument, right? We will represent their truth claim in a more complex, compelling, and reliable way than they may have at first stated it. This is a brilliant habit to practice, which I have not done here. But yes, if people are tabling truth claims in an authoritative fashion, we may inquire into what they found so convincing, or why they take these matters as seriously or as compellingly as they seem to. But there is a...
That's really nice.
Did you like the
since the vastest portion, if you will, there are no portions actually. This is again lying conceptual nonsense in English. Since the vastest portion of the real that is accessible to us is mysterious and incomplete, and also transforms depending on how we relate and participate with it. This is a crucial, pivotal feature that Mac was outlining, and some of the people who asked questions were outlining. And he said, how can we tell that we are simply recovering the facts, like as if I were to take out a kidney stone and analyze it, of a person's experience? How do we know that we're not giving birth to new ways of seeing and remembering and being together as we explore together? This is the thing I'm into. This is my way of being in my mind and in conversation and in exploration and even in articulation. Right? There's this trenchant idea that we will get at the facts, like we get at fossils in some geologic strata. Yet only the tiniest portion of human experience has anything that even resembles that. And it's mostly a left hemispheric game. And again, within contingent contexts in which it is reliable and useful and perhaps modestly appropriate, fine. Outside those contexts, no. Right? Pervading over all of human thought, conception, and knowledge, absolutely not. What you get from that is the skeletal remains of what could have been intelligence or insight. And you also get another thing, the capacity to produce machines that obliterate the substrates from which our bodies and minds arise. So you get a lot of death, right? You get some very intense death. And new forms of death, and new speeds of killing and so forth over time. This monster has to be kept in the very limited box in which we can trust that it is neither dangerous nor deceptive. And it's a monster we built. Right? This is our monster. So when I see people going like, "Where's the proof of UFOs?" I feel like, what, you want more monster? You want more stupidity? I guess what they're concerned about is delusions, hallucinations, and people making shit up. But they don't realize that they're making shit up. They're making shit up about stuff they have no experience of. And they don't want to have an experience of it. They don't want to consider it. They don't want to admit that it's plausible, likely, possible, or real. So most of what is real, this idea often supposes a prefab fixed extrinsic reality. Yeah. And so if it's not in the prefab fixed extrinsic reality, there by itself, without us making it or participating, it's not real. But that's insane. There's no chance of that being credible or trustworthy at all. Right? Because all of experience is participated, and where it is not participated, we should mistrust it very deeply. Now it is just sort of the fecal remains of processes of abstraction, standing aside from participation and discovery and insight and wonder and awe, and producing little dead tokens that we then point at and say, this is all there is. Now there's a portion of our experience, right? Is the stone hard? Not a problem. Yeah, seems hard. Right? Is the hardness real? Well, it depends on our orientation in asking the question and what kinds of evidence we're willing to admit. if it's the evidence of the feeling under my foot right now as I stand on this little this carved stone, probably from a relatively ancient church in South America, yeah, that stuff's hard. No problem there. Is it fundamentally hard? Is it absolutely hard? No. Hardness is a continuum at a very simple level. And if we take into account the findings of physics, then it should be obvious that, as physicists will ask us to suppose, even though this defies everything about our senses, the stone is mostly empty space. Right? And the reason it seems hard has to do perhaps with some unusual electromagnetic interactions between the molecules and atoms and so forth that comprise it. Yeah? So which is real? The hardness or what the physicists tell us? What the physicists tell us violates every intuition of our experience. Right? How could something filled with empty space be so heavy? Why is it so massive? Why can't I push my finger through it? Or throw it a mile? So what is real, right? If the scope of our concern is so narrow that it only admits some tiny portion of the nature of all that is, of existence and nature herself, and we say only this is real, right? Only that which I can validate is real. Well, that's not real. You know, human experience and thought and cognition, these are fuzzy, right? They're not like the edges of a knife, except in their hinterlands, which are so highly structured as to represent something like dead terrain, right? Like the pavement of roads in a city or something like this. Yeah? Our experience doesn't have explicit qualities or characteristics or features, right? The features and qualities and characteristics arise as a result of our participation and concern and awareness, motivations, purposes in inquiry or evaluation or counting. So change the aperture or the form of the lens, or hopefully lenses, right? Multiple perspectives of concern and purpose and orientation at the same time. Now you will likely get insight. Right? But if you stick to the well-traveled roads and you admit nothing from outside them, you are living in a graveyard for your intelligence and your mind. And those people who insist upon this kind of thing, they are being manipulated. There's this kind of knee-jerk habit where if one can find a flaw in some perspective or supposition or statement or so forth, one dismisses the entire statement, says, that's false. Well, that's not the way intelligence works, right? That's the way the opposite of intelligence works. You're taking a hand, or a being with two hands, and you're going to only allow it to use the fingernail on the right pinky. That will be authorized as intelligent. Any other move will be dismissed. Right? This is a demon. There's nothing like intelligence here, or learning, or anything. Yeah. And we've all been subject to this. Women and children much more. Well, men and women and children differently. Each category differently. But women have been subjugated to this for, millions of lifetimes. And children, all of them. They come into the situation where the goal is to just amputate anything that doesn't fit into the ridiculous ideological and social order of the time and place where they are born. So let us celebrate those who did not succumb. And let us become those who will not succumb together. Let us lift each other up out of this morass of lying, parading around as the protector of the truth, right? And sanity and so forth. It's relatively easy to determine the difference between someone telling a story that they've made up or invented and someone talking about a direct experience they had. But think back to the example I gave. How could I possibly prove that I encountered a dolphin? The only witnesses were the sky and the ocean. Can we interrogate them? Right? Did I not encounter a dolphin because I can't prove it? Are dolphins irreal? See, the weird thing about reality is that it's all partly irreal. Consciousness is a system of filters, and when these filters malfunction, you get the nightmare that we're living in today. But there's no aspect of consciousness ordinarily that presents the direct nature of that which is to awareness or conception. And if there were, it would probably be so overwhelming, almost certainly, that either we would die of terror and ecstasy mixed, or our minds would be ruined. Right? Thought is an array of prostheses. Many of them are very poorly forged because we learned how to think we learned what it means and can mean to be human, primarily from observing other humans. Yes, we brought some stuff with us into birth, but we didn't know what it meant to be this person here now, and we learned this from observing other humans attempting to be human. So we discover what it can mean to be human primarily by observing other humans in scenarios. The possibility of space of our humanity is excessively infinite. And I meant both excessively, EX, and accessibly infinite, meaning we can access the infinite space of possibility of our human nature, faculties, abilities, incarnation, intelligences, and so forth. This is what we must be doing with and for each other. Not rabidly attacking anything that violates the normative, ideological prison system that prevails over much of human thought and concern and consideration. That's the abduction right there. All of my life, since I was a child and was reading science fiction at a very young age and exposed to it in television and so forth, movies, I always hoped to have the opportunity to meet beings from another world. This is usually how I thought of it. This was the common conception in the 50s and 60s that UFOs and UAP were spacemen, space people. So I dreamed that one day I might be so lucky and or cursed to encounter such beings. And while I have never encountered a craft or little being-like features of that which is, I did have an experience of communication and communion with an intelligence so profound that I often joke it makes what humans generally are doing look like painting in poo with our faces and then dancing around about the results. And it radically altered not merely my ontology, but how I alter my ontology. Do we alter our ontologies? What would it take to get us to shift? Now, for the ontological tyrannists, the ontological terrorists, the ontological fascists, they're dug in. They have a bunker, right? And their bunker is, I know what can't be real. Well, good luck with that. Because the real is amenable to participatory transformation, deepening, inversion, and transcendence. If we were to get a direct taste, we could survive a taste of what is actually going on, right? So that we got a perspective that was, say, even 25% more veritable than the ones under which, we are enslaved. It would obliterate most of not merely what we've ever believed, but how we have ever thought. In other words, the underlying methods that we use to think with would be transformed dramatically. I know this from firsthand experience. Mine were, and continue to be. There is a way in which our dreaming experience is vastly more trustworthy than our waking world experience. Yet very few people could admit this, even that this is possible, right? They think of dreams as a bunch of nonsense. But nothing is as nonsensical as the sense. The arbiters of sense-making under which we labor unjustifiably, unnecessarily, idiotically. And I myself am subject to these things. One difference is that I am aware of their limitations. It does not mean I can always escape them. I strive to, but I also fail. And I have biases. And I lack an intimate cohort of co-explorers with whom which my potentials for insight and discovery would be monumentally expanded. Unless I admit that my cohort is this living world, the sky, the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars, the entirety of all that is. What humans have a grasp on about that is nearly nothing. So it's surprising how confident individual humans can be about this. This is part of the problem of individual humans, separated humans, humans that have no communal spirit, experience, understanding, awareness, and so forth. Or they have little. Or it is counterfeited. Or it is directly and intentionally manipulated. There's nothing as easy to manipulate as a separated human. This is partly why when someone is suspected of a crime, or there has been an event, they separate the people and interview them, as separate persons. So these are some of my thoughts, as nearly always happens to me. I don't know if my listeners are aware of this, but this is one of the problems with making these recordings, or even with writing or any kind of articulate creativity, music, poetics, so forth. There's a point at which you decide, this is enough for now. Okay? But always after this, after I make the recording, a cascade of new insights and, I meant to talk about this, and so forth naturally arises and becomes obvious in my awareness. So yeah, that's one of the challenges I face. Of course, one must take this gently, and be willing to fail at the goal of completely explicating or completely succeeding at one's motivation, desire. This completeness problem is trenchant for us. So these are some of my thoughts and feelings for today. I'm so grateful and humbled to have this time together. Reverent to attempt the unforgetting and, in some ways, the calling out of the disasters and their histories and characteristics that so viciously dominate here on Earth, where they are not inverted. And thankfully there are mountains in the topology. There are beings who intend liberation, rescue, insight, creativity, restoration of our spirit and our souls, our virtues. I like to hope that one day I may be counted among those folks. But for now, thank you for joining me. Please take a moment, if you will. Ask a question, like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, support my work if that feels natural. Leave a scathing criticism if you like. I will answer questions. I look at every comment. And if I don't respond, it doesn't mean I don't like your comment or anything like that. Sometimes I have to take time to consider how to respond. So if I don't respond immediately, don't think that I'm ignoring the comment. I see every comment that YouTube doesn't remove. Apparently it does remove some comments, unfortunately. I wish you beauty. May life be gentle and brilliant for you. May those you love be healthy and happy and joyful. May the spirit of insight dwell in your heart, mind, and dreaming. And I hope for the fulfillment of the promise of your human incarnations. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.